We're starting this episode with the long block back together, but there are still a few major components that we're going to need. The first of those is the intake manifold. This is the one we got with our B&M supercharger setup and sandblasted. The very first thing we'll do is clean the cylinder head intake gasket surfaces and drop the intake on with nothing else in place for a test fit. And with the bolt holes aligned, we can see how well everything fits together. This fit is really about as good as you could hope for. It sits totally flat against both cylinder heads, and the gap to the valley wall is very small. And now that we've seen that fitment, we'll drop on the intake gaskets and have another test fit. These cylinder head gaskets have little tabs that stick out and match with the intake manifold gaskets to hold them in place, which makes this much easier. And once both of those are lined up, we'll drop back on the intake. The gap at the front and rear valley walls is only about 1/10 of an inch, which RTV should easily be able to seal. So the fit looks good, but we still have to figure out which bolts to use. After test fitting a few, it seems like an 1.5 inch long bolt is the way to go. But of course, nothing is ever easy, and a few of the bolts are a bit difficult to get at. By far, the two worst offenders were the two frontmost bolts on the passenger side. The rear of the two is sandwiched very tightly between an air and coolant passage. Probably the most obvious solution to this one would be to use a socket cap bolt, but unfortunately I didn't like the fit of that either. It would need a long hex key socket, and probably have to be one with a ball on the end since it's not a totally straight shot. I've had some bad experiences in the past trying to torque down socket cap bolts with ball head sockets, so I really wanted to try something else. I decided to just grind down the head of a regular hex bolt until I could get a socket to fit in that gap in the manifold. You can absolutely buy bolts with non-standard hex sizes for situations just like this. I looked around briefly, but it seemed like I would have to get a set, and they were pretty pricey. So instead, this standard 3/8 inch by 16 bolt with a 9/16 head will be spending some quality time with the belt sander. This isn't the first time I've done this, so I know to take it really slow and just remove a little bit from each flat at a time. The tricky part is keeping the relationship between all of the flats the same so that it still fits tightly within a socket. And after a few minutes of careful sanding, it fits perfectly within a 1/2 inch socket. Only, and I probably should have tested this earlier, but the tightest fit 1/2 inch socket I have is still a little bit too big. So we'll get back to the sander and put an even smaller head on this bolt. We'll be taking it all the way down to a 7/16 head. Once we have carefully ground that down until it's a tight fit in the socket, we'll round off any sharp corners just a little bit with some regular sandpaper, and we have a successful test fit. The bolt is looking a little bit sad, but the socket fits easily within that gap. I did want to do a test of that washer though, so we'll clamp a nut in the vise and tighten down the bolt into it. Even before getting to 20 foot-pounds, it became clear that that washer was not going to work. These are just generic intake manifold bolt washers from Jegs that have a slightly smaller outer diameter than most washers, but it doesn't seem like they're hardened, or at least not very well. So with the tiny head on that bolt, it is just pulling its way through the washer. After that, I tried a graded metric washer that was also a tight fit, but it seemed like it wanted to squish a little bit too. In order to make a washer that it definitely wouldn't pull through, I took one of these thick grade 8 3/8 inch washers and ground it down on the sides. By giving that washer 2 flat sides, we were able to make it a perfect fit for that gap between the ports in the intake manifold. And now that we finally have those fasteners figured out, we should probably make sure that the valve covers fit with the intake. Once they're unpacked, we'll take a new gasket and work it into the groove on the underside of the cover. And once it's been pushed down flat all the way around, we can drop the valve cover onto the head. Then we'll go around and install all 7 bolts. We won't be fully tightening those just yet because the valve covers will have to come back off later anyway. Luckily, the cover doesn't appear to interfere with the intake at all, so we probably won't have to modify anything. But what we can do is install a new oil filler cap and the grommet for the valve cover breather. We'll thread in the cap and tighten it down, and then pop the grommet into its opening in the cover. And we'll also test fit a breather to make sure everything fits the way it should. That all looks good, so we'll go ahead and install the passenger side valve cover. Once we have its gasket installed, we'll drop it into place and snug it down with a set of bolts. Then we'll pop in a grommet identical to the one we used on the driver's side, which will later house the PCV valve. With all that bolted on there, it's really starting to look like something. And the next thing we'll do is take all of that stuff back off. The intake was still just on there for a test fit, so we'll go ahead and remove that and its gaskets. We'll also pop back off the valve covers, mainly because we're about to flip the engine over and I didn't want to get a whole bunch of oil on them before we try to paint this thing. We'll flip the engine over nice and slow since there's a lot of weight up top with the heads installed. The whole thing being upside down will make it much easier to install the oil pump. While this engine didn't come with a pump inside, it did have the old oil pump drive shaft. The factory style uses one of these plastic bushings to keep itself centered and installed on the oil pump drive. And realistically, in almost every use case, I'm sure that's fine, but I prefer to replace those with an aftermarket drive shaft that uses a pinned-in-place steel bushing. And that'll be interfacing with this new oil pump. This is a Melling M307, which is a standard volume and pressure model. It seems to fit on that main cap perfectly, just the way it should, so we'll get that oil pump drive shaft clicked into place, and drop the oil pump into the block for good. Luckily, we do have the original bolt for the oil pump, so we'll apply some oil to the threads and under the head of it and get it in place. That will get torqued to 65 foot-pounds. And with that in place, we'll install our new oil pickup tube. This is a Melling M305S, which is made to fit an 8-inch oil pan like this one. It should be very close to the right height for the pan that we made, so to have our clearance set around 1/4 of an inch, we're going to set the oil pickup tube to 7 3/4 of an inch from the base of the block. There are installation tools that help you install the oil pickup tube into the oil pump, but instead I just have a hammer. It's not the most graceful solution, however, and by the time the tube is almost completely installed, it's not the tightest fit. Either way, I was planning on making a mounting tab for the pickup, so it's not a huge concern. Now we could just set the depth with a tape measure, but I want to be a little bit more certain than that, so we'll be doing some test fits with the oil pan. And to do that, of course, we'll also need to install the new oil pan gasket. Then, over top of that, we can drop on the oil pan. It's a bit of a relief that it still fits after all the welding and debauchery that happened to make it, and it doesn't seem like it's coming into contact with the oil pickup. But to be sure, we'll have to take a measurement. To make sure we don't get any junk in there while doing so, we'll wrap the pickup screen with aluminum foil. Looking everything over now, unfortunately it seems like the pickup tube is too short to sit flat against the bottom of the pan. Which is interesting since the pan we made is the exact same depth as what it's supposed to fit. But whatever, this was the same situation we faced with the oil pickup tube on the Blazer, and that one never seemed to cause any problems. As it sits right now, the taller side is at 8 inches and the shorter side is almost 7.5. We'll give the tube a few firm taps to make sure it's as tight as possible, and for an actual test of the oil pickup to pan clearance, we're going to be using a highly calibrated banana. We'll take a precision measurement and slice off just enough to cover the oil pickup screen. The rest was delicious. This sad little piece though will be covered with another piece of aluminum foil to prevent from making a big mess. Then we'll go ahead and drop the oil pan into place. To get a more accurate reading, we'll go around and snug down a few bolts to hold the oil pan tight. This should also crush the oil pan gasket down just a little bit. Then we'll pop those back out and lift off the pan. The clearance to the pan was pretty high and over 1/2 inch all the way around. This will serve as a baseline though, and we'll use the Sharpie witness marks we made to reinstall it in a similar position. For now, we need to secure the tube, and to do that, we'll be using 2 of the bolts on the oil pump cover plate, so we'll go around in a crisscross pattern and loosen all of the bolts to relieve tension, but only remove the 2 that we'll use to mount the pickup. We'll make a little cardboard template of the mounting tab, and once it seems like we've figured out the shape, that'll get traced over to a piece of 16 gauge steel. We'll drill 2 1/4-inch holes for the mounting bolts, and use the angle grinder to cut out the rough shape. Then we'll do some finishing and corner rounding on the belt sander. And there's our mounting tab. We'll make sure that's clean and drop it onto the oil pump. We'll thread back in the 2 removed bolts and then snug all of them down. The fitment is looking decent, so now all we have to do is attach that tab to the pickup tube. To do that, and hopefully not make too big of a mess of our assembled engine, we'll lay down some cardboard and aluminum foil to help protect it. We'll position the tube just a bit higher than it was previously based on the Sharpie mark, and use that good old messy flux core wire to tack weld it in place. Then, once I've made a nice big mess, I'll unbolt that tube, remove it from the pump, and fully weld the tab with it in the bench vise. And after cleaning it up a little, this is what we're left with. The biggest benefit of making a tab like this instead of just welding the pickup tube into the pump is that it's totally removable and easy to install. Then we'll reapply the scientifically smushed banana, wrap it in foil, and go in for another oil pan test fit. Immediately, it's looking better than before, but it's still not great. The lowest part is under 1/4 of an inch, but the highest edge is still over 1/2 inch. So we'll get it even closer to the pan by giving the tab a tweak. And it's time for yet another test fit. This time the low spot is only 1/8 of an inch from the pan, but the high spot is still a little over 1/2 inch. It's not great, but unfortunately with this pickup tube I think it's the best we'll be able to do. We'll be calling that good enough, so we can remove our testing produce and unbolt that oil pickup tube one last time. Since it fits kind of loosely in the pump, I decided to put a little bit of RTV around the outside of the tube to help make sure no air is getting in there. We'll also fully unbolt the bottom pump cover and apply some assembly lube. It's surely not necessary, but it couldn't hurt to have a little extra lubrication in here for the first time it starts spinning. Then we'll reinstall all of the bolts with a touch of blue thread locker. We'll pop our RTV to pick up into place, get all the bolts snug, and then torque them in a crisscross pattern to 80 inch-pounds. Finally, the oil pump is installed along with its very sturdy pickup, and we can move on to installing the oil pan for good. We'll pull the pan gasket back off and make sure the corners of the timing cover and the rear main cap are nice and clean. That's because each of those 4 spots will be getting a dab of RTV. Even with a good gasket, those transition spots will tend to leak, so it's a good idea to seal them right now. Then we can drop the gasket in place one more time and lower down the oil pan. To tighten it down, we'll be using 20 5/16 by 18 flange bolts that are 3/4 of an inch long. We'll apply engine oil to the threads of each one and get them all snugged down. Then we'll come in with the torque wrench and tighten them in 3 steps. First, we'll go through and get all of them to 60 inch-pounds, then 110 inch-pounds, and finally one final pass at 156 inch-pounds. After all that work on it, I didn't want to give the pan flange any excuses to warp. I was hoping this would help pull it flat. The bolts all pulled down nicely, and that pan is on there nice and solid. While we're here, we may as well also install the drain bolt. This is a standard 1/2 inch by 13 flange bolt with a washer that we cut out of fiber gasket material. With some oil applied to the gasket and threads, we'll thread that in and torque it to 25 foot-pounds. And with that looking good, we can also install the oil filter. We'll apply a little bit of oil to the seal, thread it on, and get it nice and tight. It's a big relief to have the oil pump pickup sorted and the pan installed. Now all I have to do is get the engine back upright without dumping the whole stand onto the ground. And with that, we're finally ready to actually install the intake manifold. We'll give the valley rails and head surfaces a wipe down with acetone to make sure there's no assembly lube that leaked down onto them, and squeeze a long bead of RTV all the way across the rear valley rail, and the front rail, making sure that there's enough sealer where the head meets the block. We'll also add a very light coat of RTV around all of the coolant passages. In hindsight, I probably should have done the intake ports on this side of the gasket too, for a reason we'll see in just a minute. We'll carefully lay down the intake manifold gaskets on top of all of that, and we took a moment to circle all of the ports on the intake manifold with RTV before dropping it onto its gaskets. In order to keep from spreading RTV all over the place, a well-aligned, careful install is important. Everything's looking good, so we'll grab our bolts, washers, and thread sealer. We'll apply a thread sealer to each and every one of these 1.5 inch long bolts and get them all started by hand. Then, once they're all in place, we'll go around and start snugging them down. We'll tighten those in 2 steps, first 15 foot-pounds, and then all the way to 30. For the bolt that we modified, we had to use a 7/16 inch 1/4 inch drive socket, but it did the trick and tightened down just fine. We were able to torque all of them except for the front passenger side bolt. So we'll just get it nice and tight with a combination wrench. And we'll go back over all of them at 30 foot-pounds just to make sure everything is totally even. We'll make sure there's not too much excess RTV sticking out anywhere, and give everything a visual examination to make sure the intake is flush with the cylinder heads. Everything's matching up well, except the intake ports. Even without the test fits, I knew this was going to be a problem. The intake manifold looks like it's been port matched, and I don't know exactly how big the original setup was, but as is, it's sure making those peanut port heads look pretty small. The transitional airflow between the two is pretty much as bad as it can be. For this, and many of the other reasons we've covered, it will be very interesting to see how this engine performs. Continuing with reassembly, let's also get the valve covers back into place, and tighten them down. It's great to see the engine back together like this, and not have to expect that we'll take it apart soon. And the next big step will be to give it a total makeover. The time has come to paint the engine, and in order to get good adhesion, we'll need to get the exterior of the engine as clean as possible. Most of the oil on the surface is just WD-40, which is pretty easy to remove. First, we'll just give everything a spray down with brake cleaner. Then we'll start wiping down surfaces with acetone and shop towels. Then a more localized spray down and wipe down with brake clean. We'll be doing this in the garage to have a more controlled environment, but also because it was raining on and off outside. The garage doors are open and a box fan is blowing full blast over the engine and out the door to help with fumes. The engine will get one more spray down and then wipe down with acetone. Then, to clear up any puddles of solvent, but also make sure everything is dry so that it's easier to see any remaining oil spots, we'll go over the whole thing with compressed air. Then one final spray down to clear up any remaining oil, and a once over with the air compressor. I spent about 25 minutes on this whole spraying down and de-oiling process. And now that we had everything reasonably clean, the next step was to mask some things off. First, we'll lay down some masking tape on the supercharger mounting flange. In the past, I've used a handful of different strategies to make masking tape match a machined surface, but during all of the masking required for this project, I found a new favorite. This is a 1-inch diameter piece of hardened steel rod. I'm using it to press the tape down against the edge of the sharp machined surface, which cuts the tape itself. It won't work in every contour or for every situation, but it sure is fast and leaves a nicer finish than using a hammer to cut these same edges. To mask off larger areas, we'll use cardboard or newspaper in addition to the tape. We'll make sure all of the ports are plugged or taped. In this case, I'm not going to specifically mask off the exhaust ports like I've done in the past because I want to see if that affects sealing at all. For a lot of the ports, we're just using temporary plugs or shoving in shop towels. Though since the balancer wasn't installed, I wanted to make absolutely sure that no paint was going to get on that front seal. As for the oil filter, they're temporary anyway. The paint of choice is the same Rust-Oleum engine enamel we were using in previous episodes, in the cast coat aluminum color. I kind of just defaulted to a color I already knew I liked because it was a bit tricky choosing a paint for this engine. Painting a Chevy engine Pontiac blue would be a stick in the eye for Pontiac enthusiasts, but painting it a bright Chevy orange also doesn't really seem right in a Firebird. So even though it's a little ostentatious and it could seem like I'm trying to pass off this hunk of iron as an aluminum block, I kinda just defaulted to silver because I didn't like any of the other options. I really like this cast coat aluminum color because it's not totally matte, but it's not super glossy either. It does a nice job of smoothing over surface imperfections without covering over too much of the detail. But perhaps even more than all that, maybe the biggest primal attractant for me is that it's anti-seize silver. And well, who can hate that? I'll also note that I originally intended to keep the oil pan bed liner black, but I was having a lot of trouble getting any masking tape to stick to it. So honestly, I just got lazy and I decided to paint it silver as well. We'll be applying this in a few light coats, and we'll keep that box fan blowing air out of the garage the whole time. Still, I made sure to wear a respirator throughout the painting process. It was also pretty cold in the garage at that time, so I had a small space heater pointed directly at the engine, though I made sure to turn it off and move it away while spraying to avoid that potential fire risk. From my experience, this paint isn't real picky about waiting in between coats or anything like that, so I was only giving it 15 to 30 minutes between each coat to dry. In total, it got 4 coats over the course of about 2 hours. In between those coats, we can also take care of a few other things, like painting this water pump. I ended up finding this aluminum water pump for just a few bucks more than a regular cast iron one, so it seemed like a pretty good choice. It's sold as a high volume pump, although I have my doubts about exactly how high that volume might be, and there's a whole debate about whether or not a high volume pump is a good idea for a standard street vehicle, but I figure it's a low RPM engine, and I want to do everything possible to help keep this engine cool, so it seemed like it was at least worth a try. Anyway, we'll give that a few coats of the same cast aluminum paint. The pump is already cast aluminum, but this should help make the colors match with everything else, and as anyone who's tried to clean porous cast aluminum knows, it gets dirty and really holds onto that. This layer of paint will make it much easier to keep clean. Back to the engine, it's been almost 2 hours since the last coat of paint. It is dry to the touch, but we will be letting it sit around for a couple of days to fully cure. We'll remove some of the masking materials, but others we'll leave in place just to protect it while it sits out. Before just leaving it be, there is one final painting touch that I want to make on this engine. This is the same engine enamel that we just used, only it's in semi-gloss black. I'm going to take one of these little brake clean caps and fill it with a bit of that paint. Since we just painted everything silver, the engine is looking a little bit one note. So just for a little bit of extra flair, we'll take a sponge brush and paint the fins on the valve covers. I tried to apply the paint as lightly as I possibly could to prevent any from dripping down to the base of the fins. The sponge brush worked pretty well for this. 1 or 2 tiny spots had drips or runs, which I tried to clean up with a shop towel and a bit of acetone. It didn't come out flawless, but it's got some character, and I actually really dig that old hand-painted valve cover kinda look. It's really exciting to be at the stage where I'm worried about how nice paint lines look versus just finding enough parts to put this engine back together. It's definitely come a hell of a long way from where it started. Based on some of the things I had to do to make this build happen, it's hard to say if that was in the right direction or not, but boy, sitting here assembled and fully painted, it sure looks nice, at least. There were obviously some challenges and surprises when trying to put this engine back together, but honestly, it's a pretty simple thing and it went together pretty well. However, as you'll see in the next few episodes as we work through the rebuild for the B&M 250 supercharger that's supposed to go on top of this engine, it took a lot of research, trial and error, trying to find parts, building those parts when I couldn't find them, and no shortage of failure. So look forward to that mess. At least, for now, we have a big chunk of this build finished, giving some hope that One day, this engine will run again. Metric bolts. No!